Welcome once again to Take 5, an inventory series, where we sift through the healthcare supply chain news of the day so you can keep your hands clean. I'm Alex Diamond, and I once again asked hospital inventory veteran Carl Nattenstead about how procurement pros prepare for a pandemic.
We know future pandemics are coming. I mean, we've had H1N1, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had Ebola, we've had Zika. So those past experiences should tell us that another pandemic is coming. And COVID has certainly been extraordinary in its scale, in its breadth, and it also in just the focus that the media and our politicians have put on it. But it is just another pandemic, and another one is coming. So what we need to do is not try to predict it and guess, like we're trying to guess the stock market, but rather have a really solid plan in place for being prepared for it, and then a plan that we can immediately kick into gear the minute it occurs. And so what we've seen in many reports I've seen have said we're using, for example, in the PPE area, we're using 10x the number of PPE that we would normally use. So how does a supply chain, especially one that's operating in a just-in-time environment, prepare for or plan for that type of a pandemic response? And so as a supply chain leader, it's your job to almost over-prepare for the pandemic to make sure that your frontline healthcare workers are never put at risk. And that means you're going to end up with excess stock. Every hospital that I know of in the country was gearing up for a large influx of COVID-19 patients. And frankly, many of them will never have that influx of patients. If you're doing your job right, you'll probably have excess at the end. So you need to have a backup plan, or the second part of the plan needs to be, how do I then deal with all of this excess stock? So you have to plan for rotation, meaning you're going to have to bring that pandemic supply into your normal supply chain operation and consume it on a regular basis, and then replenish it if that's going to be your strategy. And so how is that going to be consumed and utilized and managed to make sure that we don't have expiration and loss from the expense of buying all that, especially considering the fact that most of that was bought at higher prices than normal. So it becomes even more important to manage that excess. You can't just build up a large off-site pandemic inventory supply and then forget about it for 5 years until the next, COVID-19 hits, and then go roll up the door and expect that inventory to all be useful. I believe that's what happened to FEMA. They rolled up the door and started to pull out masks, and they disintegrated literally in their hands. The same thing happened to most health systems, that the first thing that they had to do was figure out, where do I have PPE and how much of it do I have? And the simple reason for that is that many health systems don't track PPE at the same level of specificity that was required during the pandemic. So I would like to think, and I think, especially given Z5's involvement in inventory management, I'd like to think that everybody's going to come out of the pandemic and start tracking their PPE down to the last mask. However, I don't think that's necessarily realistic. I think that at some point, we're going to return to semi-normal operations, and that might mean some further tracking and accountability for PPE, but I don't think it's going to mean universally across the health system we're going to track every last item down to its final destination. So we all read the paper and saw the news early on when New York needed 40,000 ventilators. What we don't know is what's happened since New York is now kind of ramped down in terms of its ventilator consumption, or as we know, never used 40,000 ventilators. Are those ventilators now being repurposed? Are they being used in Louisiana or up in Connecticut, where we now have new hotspots, or Detroit? Or do we still have the same problem in Detroit, where they're searching for ventilators while New York sits on 10, 20, 30,000 extras? So because we don't have good visibility across the industry, I think we run the risk of overstocking both medical equipment like ventilators, as well as supplies like masks, gowns, etc. I think a great plan for future pandemics is to have more supply chain visibility across organizations. That would be my advice to supply chain professionals in healthcare.
That's this week's 5 Minutes. Join us next week as we talk about a surprising consequence of a pandemic: hospital closures. Take 5 is a production of Z5 Inventory. To see all of our sources and resources for this episode and more, visit z5inventory.com. That's the letter Z, the number 5, and the word inventory.com.